I don't know about the rest of you, but I love futuristic battles. And ancient battles. And modern ones. Battles are just cool in general. Get it? Because generals are the guys... Okay. There's a reason that so much of the fantasy and sci-fi genres include big epic battles, and that reason is just that they're cool. Sometimes they represent conflict between different ideologies, but usually they're just a big spectacle wherein your favorite characters are put in danger and try to achieve their goals in a direct, stimulating manner. That being said, nothing takes me out of a battle more than when something doesn't make sense. Fantasy is bad at this since battles usually just consist of the hero giving an epic speech before two mobs crash into each other and the victor is determined by what the plot demands, but sci-fi is full of equally dumb things like giant robots, main characters fighting with swords, and infantry advancing in massed Napoleonic formations. Military sci-fi is usually better about this sort of thing since the entire point of the genre is to have cool battles and so the writers tend to know their shit. So I'm making this as a guide for those who want to have better science fiction militaries and conflicts. It's basic, but it'll give you a place to start. Part 1. Organization. There's a saying that modern war was created during the French Revolution. This isn't because of new technology or tactics, but because this is when entire countries began to devote themselves to fighting. Before this, war was mostly nobles fighting other nobles. The idea of peasants being in the army was pretty rare. But when the French monarchy was overthrown, France became a country that was, ostensibly, for everyone and run by everyone. This meant that everyone put their effort into the fighting. Men volunteered or were conscripted into the army because at that point the survival of the country was at stake, not just who was in charge. So the size of French armies ballooned like crazy, and then their opponents had to follow suit in order to combat them. When everybody could join the army and learn to fight, the lives of soldiers became cheap. When all the factories are churning out guns and bullets, you won't hesitate to use them. 400 years earlier, knights and their arms were horrifically expensive, limiting army sizes and what they could do. In just about any sci-fi setting, armies should be organized along lines similar to efficient modern ones. Almost everyone can join, receive training, and be given a role. Fighting on the front lines is the most obvious one, but remember that modern armies need legions of clerical workers, mechanics, and communications networks to keep themselves supplied and directed. But most of you are probably here to learn about how the front lines are organized, so I'll focus on that. Nowadays, battles take place over gigantic areas, and while armies have always been split up into pieces, they used to be much bigger pieces that were more tightly controlled by whoever was in charge of the army. They had people like sergeants who commanded small groups of men, but their role was usually just to relay orders from higher up. They had little flexibility. Obviously, this varied, but this was the general idea. This continued in most militaries until the early 20th century, when generals realized that they couldn't possibly be in control of every part of a battle from way behind the lines. That's when they realized that lower officers need more flexibility in achieving their objectives. In the future, this will either stay the same or get even more decentralized. With even more soldiers fighting over an even bigger area, it'll be even more impossible for one person to command everything. Soldiers can be organized in big units of hundreds or thousands of people, but they can also operate in small groups of a dozen or less depending on the situation. There is a very clear chain of command in modern militaries, and disobeying orders is dealt with harshly. And unless you're in a dictatorship, the generals will be subject to civilian authorities. Everyone has roles and duties that are very clearly laid out for them. Then there's stuff like armored vehicles and air support, which are absolutely necessary for anything other than low-intensity guerrilla fighting. I've seen too many examples of modern or future armies that have infantry bunched up and marching/charging in Napoleonic formations. If you want to see how that would work out, just look at the First World War, or even earlier to events like Pickett's Charge. Things like machine guns, guided missiles, and explosive weapons would tear an army like that apart. If an army is advancing through hostile terrain, and especially if it's open terrain, then they need to use combined arms to avoid being slaughtered. Armored vehicles, air support, and infantry all moving together, supporting each other, and defending each other. And they rarely move in a big mass. They'll be spread out in formations to prevent the enemy from concentrating their fire on any one spot. But once you bring in things like that, the subject changes to Part 2. Weaponry. The thing about sci-fi is that, unlike fantasy, there's no generic template that we can follow. More than that, the technology involved is made up, which means we don't know exactly how it works or what it can do. With swords and spears, we can look back and see how those worked and the way they were used in combat. Here, the only limit is your imagination. This means that you can go absolutely nuts with the sort of equipment that militaries have access to, and they can be as realistic as you want. Regular kinetic weapons, lasers that blow up planets, airships, giant robots, and space battleships are all staples of the genre. How much sense does this make? Let's start with lasers. Those are the weapons of the future, right? Well, not really. They require a lot of energy to power them, and getting a power source small enough to fit in a pistol or rifle would be difficult, though not impossible. Then there's the lack of range that lasers have. There's this thing called thermal blooming, which basically means that the air absorbs part of the beam's radiation as it passes through, which severely limits how far it can go. And in modern war, having less range than your opponents is a serious disadvantage. Even worse, lasers cauterize any wounds that they cause, meaning that they would wound but not kill very often. Technically, blasters in the Star Wars universe fire clouds of ionized gas and not lasers, so they actually burn you with superheated steam. I'll give that one a pass, but the other franchises that do this are guilty. Lasers can be used as stationary defenses, though. Set up a big cannon on your base or the outside of your spaceship and use it to shoot down approaching missiles. They'd be more likely to have something like a nuclear reactor that can power them, too. Really, it would just be easier to stick to regular bullets in most circumstances. Railguns fall into much the same trap. They require so much power that it's currently unfeasible to use them on a small scale, and on a large scale it's easier to just use big artillery. In the future this could change, but until it becomes cost efficient to use railguns instead of gunpowder weaponry, we're going to keep using gunpowder weaponry. As much as I hate to say this, giant robots just don't make sense in combat. I love Gundam as much as the next guy, but taking a large human-shaped object and putting it in a battlefield is just wasting money. If anyone hits the legs, then it'll collapse in on itself. And if it can fly, then it would be a harder target to hit. But in that case, why not just use a plane? Or some sort of hovercraft, since it's the future. Things like tanks just make more sense. They move fast, have heavy armor, and a low profile that makes them harder to take down. Not to mention that they all have a cannon which is attached to them and can't be knocked out of their hands like weapons on a humanoid machine. And what about nuclear weapons? Those have been around since 1945. And in the modern day we have the capability to launch them across continents, but they almost never get brought up in sci-fi. I think part of the reason is just that they're too powerful. You could wipe out all life on a planet with a single barrage, or an entire city with one missile, and modern technology has no idea how to counter this, as opposed to something like the Death Star, which is a big target you can blow up. So how do we avoid making future battles nothing but nuke fights? The most obvious idea is just that the people involved want to conquer/protect without killing everyone, which is fine. Another is to have some sort of counter. The only franchise I've ever seen do this is an anime called Gundam Seed. Before the events of the show start, soldiers from space colonies put neutron jammers in Earth's crust, which prevents all nuclear reactions from taking place and means neither side can launch nukes at each other. Does this spit in the face of physics? Yeah, but so does half the other tech in that show. I know there are some people out there who hate Gundam Seed and say that it's the worst Gundam out there. Well, it's actually amazing. Fuck you, fight me. What I mean here is that you should come up with a reason that everything hasn't devolved into nuke fights in the future. And no using swords. I don't care how cool they are, we stopped using them for a reason. Part 3. Defense and Fortifications. In the past, if you wanted to defend from an army, you would construct something like a castle or a wall. Then cannons were invented, and walls became useless. By the time World War I ended, static defenses had mostly given way to something called defense in depth. Defense in depth is basically where you try to delay an attacker and damage them as much as possible, rather than simply stopping them. For example, a static defense would be something like a single trench line filled with soldiers and machine gun nests, and they defend that line at all costs. But once the enemy breaks through that line, that's it. There might be a secondary line of defense, but that would have the same problem. When standard defenses break, they shatter. A defense in depth strategy would be something more like a series of trench lines that are lightly defended and go back several miles. When the enemy approaches, the soldiers inside would do as much damage as they could before retreating, so as the enemy marches further and further into their lines, they'd be getting more and more beaten down and tired until they were vulnerable enough for a counterattack. Obviously, this is an oversimplification. If you want some good examples of this, look up the Hindenburg Line or the Soviet defenses during the Battle of Kursk. In modern war, we have such powerful weapons and so much mobility with things like tanks and planes that armies can't afford to put all their resources into rigid defenses that shatter once they're broken. They need flexibility, and they need to be able to move their men and materials around the war zone. And on a bigger scale, what if the enemy has control of the air or control of space above the battlefield? What's to stop them from just bombing the shit out of whatever strongholds they want? In real life, we have things like guided missiles and anti-air guns to prevent this. So if the defenders have something like a giant cannon that can fire into space, then ships can't come close enough to attack. So strong points can and should still be used, but they aren't the end-all be-all. I don't have a good segue, so Part 3.5, Urban Warfare. Fighting in cities is hard. Basically, every building is either a strong defensive point, or a sniper's nest, or a great place for an ambush, or a great spot to set booby traps. Even heavily bombing the area won't get rid of everyone who wants to keep you out. There's no way to handle this other than to send in tons of infantry to clear things out one building at a time. There's a reason that city battles like Fallujah and Stalingrad are famous for being awful. Whether you're dealing with professional military or a lightly armed guerrilla force, fighting in cities sucks. If you're the attacker. If you're the defender, cities are a God-sent gift. The difficult terrain is perfect for building in-depth defenses. Even if you can't keep your opponent from taking a city, you can make yourself such a difficult target that they won't go near you, or just wear them down so much that you can retake it immediately, or just damage it so much that it's worthless to them. TLDW, fighting in cities is awful and wonderful at the same time. Part 4, Supplies and Logistics. This one should be simple. Every army in history has moved on its stomach, and with the march of technology, they now need things like fuel, rubber, ammunition, and replacement parts to fix their vehicles when they break down. They need to have a complex, robust supply chain to keep them in the fight. Without that, they lose very quickly. Now, you shouldn't spend time building an entire supply corps and detailing every truck, railroad, and ship that they use to transport stuff. Rather, keep in mind that things like transport hubs and roads are extremely important to a war effort. Capturing or damaging them can be a great way to hinder your opponent's war effort, which means guarding them is a big deal. In fact, it's not uncommon for armies to go after locations that are important to transport, like Moscow, Stalingrad, and Dresden during World War II. It gives you resources while taking them away from your opponent. But at the same time, infrastructure tends to get destroyed during the fighting, so the advancing force has to expend time and energy repairing it. It's the issue every conquering army has ever faced, stretching themselves too thin and becoming vulnerable. And on a smaller scale, sabotage is one of the most effective ways for a guerrilla force to fight a larger and better supplied one. Take out the road they transport things on and they'll have a harder time fighting you. When you bring space into the equation, things are a bit different. See, space is big, and depending on how you design the space travel, it could be almost impossible to chase down ships. They can go just about anywhere to avoid you. But places like planets or space stations would still exist as hubs, and places where raw resources come from are still going to be important. In a lot of ways, space transport would probably be similar to ocean transport before the advent of aerial reconnaissance. It takes place over a huge region with only a few safe harbors, and if you're on the run, you can hide by just moving far away. Depending on how radar works in your setting, at least. In fact, things like pirates and privateers might make a comeback if spaceships and weapons are cheap enough. They don't have to be high quality necessarily, just enough to threaten civilian vessels. Somali pirates don't have advanced weaponry, but they still manage to do their thing fairly well. Anyways, just keep in mind that supply is the beating heart of any army, and the more advanced the army is, the more important supplying it becomes. Part 5. Branches. Infantry, Cavalry, Air Force, Navy. Generally speaking, all armed forces fell into one of these categories, and they all fulfilled their own roles. I've talked a lot about infantry already. They do a large chunk of the fighting, and just about all of holding on to important areas. I'm including artillery in here, and that's the very definition of a glass cannon. Artillery can be used to pound defensive positions or wreck opponents in the field, but they only work at extreme ranges, and once you get close enough to them, you can capture or destroy them without much trouble. Cavalry used to use animals, but now things like tanks fulfill that same role. In open battle, they work like a hammer to smash through opposing forces, but if they're unsupported, they'll be torn to pieces. Air forces are similar to cavalry in that they exist to do just as much damage as possible and then leave. They just do it from the sky and not the ground. And, like cavalry, they can't do much unsupported, and they can't hold on to territory. Navies are there to protect the ocean and the coasts, to prevent hostile forces from landing and make sure trade keeps flowing. Sometimes they can bombard coastal forts and stuff, but, well, that's the gist of it. Space adds something new to the equation. It would probably serve a similar role to the ocean. It's big and mostly serves as an obstacle to getting to where you really want. Hell, space is even more empty since at least the ocean has fish in it. Space battles, on the other hand, will depend completely on how you set things up. Do the ships have a way to dampen or remove their inertia so that they can stop on a dime? If not, then they'll have difficulty changing direction or maneuvering. Can they outrun projectiles? Then armor is less needed. Do they fight using missiles or railguns or something else? Missiles can be shot down, kinetic projectiles can't. Do they have shields or armor? And if so, how much damage can they take? Ask yourself some of these questions and you'll be able to make space campaigns that, even if they aren't strictly realistic, make sense. Part 6. Irregulars and Insurgents. So if you don't have access to tanks and planes and other heavy weapons, then you can't meet somebody who has them in open battle. That means you're screwed, right? Not at all. By resorting to more unusual ways of fighting, a lightly armed force can still severely damage a better equipped/supplied one. Guerrilla fighting is basically just when a force hides out, attacks the other force when they see an opportunity, then goes back into hiding before the fighting escalates to a point where they can't fight back. Forces like the Viet Minh, later the Viet Cong, and the Taliban have used these sorts of tactics to hold off the most powerful militaries in the world. They don't have to completely devastate their opponents, they just have to hurt them enough to make holding on to their territory not worth the cost. A part of world building that I feel gets left by the wayside is this type of insurgency. When a big war happens, writers generally treat it like the victorious army automatically has a stranglehold over conquered territories, or at the very least they brush off insurgents as a minor nuisance that gets quashed within a few months. If you want to make your setting stand out a bit, consider making guerrillas more of a focus and have a bigger impact on armed conflicts. Just remember that without the support of the local populace, they won't be able to hide for very long. Conclusion. There's a reason that officers have to spend 4 years in an academy before they're allowed to be put in charge of anything, and that's because this shit is complicated. All I'm giving you here is some basic information on how to build and use a fighting force that makes sense. Just keep in mind that since you get to make up a lot of your own technology, it's entirely possible to come up with something that changes the rules or circumvents them in some way. Think it through and you'll come to the best conclusion. Thanks again for watching. Thanks especially to Christopher Hawkins, Joseph Pendergraft, and my other patrons you see here. If you want to help support me and the channel, then check out my page and consider donating. And if you can't do that, then simply liking the video and sharing it to help it spread is great too. See you later.